My name is Joyce Ridgway, and I am 28 years old. For the longest time, I believed my life had settled into something safe and predictable, the kind of quiet happiness people don't post about online because it feels too ordinary to brag about. My husband and I had been married for 3 years together for 2 before that, and our days followed a rhythm I trusted: work dinner, small arguments about chores, lazy weekends, inside jokes that only made sense to us. There was comfort in knowing what came next. There was comfort in believing I was chosen fully and without comparison. Nicole had always been part of that picture. She wasn't just my best friend. She was woven into every version of me I'd ever been. We met in kindergarten, 2 little girls clutching crayons with the same nervous smile, and we never really let go after that. We grew up side by side, survived awkward teenage phases, heartbreaks, college stress, and all the versions of ourselves we outgrew. People used to joke that we were a package deal. I never minded. I trusted her with my life. She married Travis a year ago. He was protective, devoted, solid, in a way that made you feel safe standing near him. The 4 of us went on double dates, sometimes nothing extravagant, just dinners, drinks, shared laughter. From the outside, we probably looked like one of those couples people envy. I thought we were lucky. Jacob didn't know Nicole well in high school. We'd only been acquaintances back then, passing nods in hallways, nothing memorable. Years later, at a high school reunion, we actually talked. Nicole missed that night because she was sick. Jacob and I ended up sitting at the same table laughing about old teachers, realizing how much we had in common. He asked me out not long after. It felt organic, easy. I never once thought the past would reach forward and poison what we built. The night everything cracked started like so many others. We'd both had an exhausting week, and by the time we finished a full bottle of wine, our words were looser, our laughter louder. We decided to play that silly game where you name 5 celebrities you'd hypothetically hook up with no jealousy allowed. It was stupid and harmless. I rattled off my list without thinking. Jacob hesitated. He named 4. I teased him, leaning across the couch laughing, telling him he couldn't leave it unfinished. I wasn't trying to trap him. I was drunk, relaxed, feeling playful in my own home with my own husband. That's the part that still hurts the most, how safe I felt right before everything collapsed. He stared at his glass for a moment too long, then smiled like he'd just made up his mind about something important. When he said Nicole's name at first, I thought I'd misheard him. I laughed automatically, waiting for the punchline that never came. He chuckled too, like it was some inside joke we were sharing, but there was an edge to it that made my stomach tighten. I asked him if he was serious. I reminded him that the point of the game was celebrities, people we'd never meet, not real people who sat at our dinner table. He shrugged and told me he was serious. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and wrong. Then he kept going. He said he'd had a crush on Nicole back in high school. Said it casually, like he was talking about an old song he used to like. Before I could even process that, he added that back then he'd always thought of me as her less attractive sidekick. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. It felt like someone had pressed pause on my body while my mind scrambled to understand what I'd just heard. Less attractive sidekick. Not just unattractive. Not just a comparison. A role. A shadow. Something that existed only to make someone else shine brighter. He didn't stop. He talked about how lucky Travis was, about how he'd love to spend a day with a woman like Nicole. I watched his mouth move, watched the man I married reduce me to an afterthought in my own life, and I realized something terrifying in that moment. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He genuinely didn't see anything wrong with what he was saying. I left the room without a word. I didn't slam doors or throw accusations. I just walked away, my legs carrying me to the bedroom, while my heart stayed behind, beating uselessly in the living room. I cried silently into the pillow, anger and shame tangling so tightly I couldn't tell them apart. I was drunk enough that sleep eventually dragged me under, but even then, part of me knew I wouldn't wake up and forget. I didn't. The next morning, my head throbbed. My mouth tasted like regret, and Jacob sat at the table eating cereal like nothing had happened. I watched him for a second longer than necessary, wondering how someone could sleep so peacefully after tearing their spouse apart with words. When I asked him if he meant what he'd said, he didn't hesitate. He told me it was true, his tone flat, almost bored. When I asked if he still found Nicole attractive, he answered yes without missing a beat. Something inside me snapped then. I raised my voice. I demanded to know how he could talk about my best friend like that, how he could compare us, how he could say those things to his wife. Instead of apologizing, he told me I needed to accept it and move on. He said he loved me more, that I was his soulmate, but Nicole was objectively more attractive. If it came down to physical attraction alone, he'd pick her every time, and he expected me not to be offended by that. He called me petty when I cried. He called me selfish when I got angry. He said he wasn't going to lie just to make me feel better about myself. Then he blamed me for starting the game at all, for teasing him for asking questions I supposedly didn't want honest answers to. When he left for work, the house felt hollow, like the walls themselves had overheard something unforgivable. I didn't go to work that day. I cried on and off, staring at my phone, realizing with a sick twist of irony that the two people I usually turned to, my husband and my best friend, were now the center of the same wound. For 2 days, Jacob and I barely spoke. He was convinced he'd done nothing wrong. On the third day, I finally broke and told Nicole everything. She was furious on my behalf, shaking with anger, ready to confront him. I stopped her not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wasn't ready to face what this meant yet. By the time she mentioned how different things would be if Travis were around, when Jacob said things like that, a cold, dangerous clarity settled over me. The hurt I'd been drowning in hardened into something sharper, something purposeful. And for the first time since that night on the couch, I didn't feel powerless anymore. Nicole didn't stop pacing my living room for a full 10 minutes after I finished telling her everything. Her jaw was tight. Her hands clenched, that familiar protective fire in her eyes that had gotten her into trouble more than once when we were younger. I'd seen her angry before, but this was different. This wasn't loud. It was controlled, simmering, the kind of anger that scared even me a little. "He said that to you?" she asked again, like repeating it might somehow make it less real. "Your husband said that to your face." I nodded. Saying the words out loud felt like reopening a cut that hadn't even started to scab. Hearing them reflected back to me made them heavier, uglier. Nicole swore under her breath and reached for her phone, already unlocking it. I grabbed her wrist. "Please don't call him. Not yet." She looked at me like I'd just asked her to do the impossible. "Joyce, he doesn't get to talk about you like that. He doesn't get to talk about me like that either." "I know," I said quickly. I need time. I need to think." That was the truth, or at least part of it. The other part was that I was still trying to understand how the man I slept next to every night could look at me and see someone he'd settled for. How long he'd been doing it. How many compliments had been backhanded without me realizing it. How many moments I'd brushed off as insecurity when they were actually warning signs. Nicole finally put her phone down, but her anger didn't fade. She sat next to me, her voice lower now, steadier. She told me what I already knew, but hadn't been ready to admit that what Jacob said wasn't just drunken honesty. It was cruelty. It was disrespect so deep it didn't come from one bad night, but from years of entitlement. She told me that love didn't look like that. Marriage didn't sound like that. And she told me bluntly that I deserved better. Hearing it from her made my chest ache in a way Jacob's words hadn't, because Nicole loved me without comparison. She always had. That night after she left, I tried to sleep in my own bed. Jacob came home late, said nothing to me, climbed in beside me, like we were just another couple riding out a minor disagreement. I lay there staring at the ceiling, every inch of my body tense, aware of his presence, in a way that felt invasive now. I wondered if he was thinking about her. I wondered if he always had. The next morning, he acted almost cheerful. He asked if I wanted coffee. He kissed my cheek like it was a habit, not a gesture that meant anything. When I pulled away and told him we needed to talk, his expression shifted, not to concern, but to irritation, like I was dragging out something he'd already decided was over. I told him how much he'd hurt me. I told him that what he said about Nicole and about me had replayed in my head nonstop. I told him I couldn't unhear being called her less attractive sidekick. My voice shook, but I didn't cry. I wanted him to see the damage clearly. Instead, he sighed. "You're still on this?" he asked, spoon clinking against his bowl. "Joyce, I told you the truth. Would you rather I lied?" "I would rather you respected me," I snapped. He looked genuinely confused by that. He told me I was blowing it out of proportion. He told me attraction didn't disappear just because you got married, and that I was naive if I thought otherwise. When I asked him how he'd feel if I talked about wanting to sleep with one of his friends, he waved it off, saying it wasn't the same. Of course it wasn't. Nothing ever was when it came to him. By the time he left for work again, I felt smaller than I had in years. Not because of what he'd said that morning, but because of how easily he dismissed my pain. I spent the day replaying our entire relationship, scanning for moments I'd ignored. His comments about women at work, his habit of ranking people, even when he said it jokingly, the way compliments always seemed to come with a comparison attached. When he came home that evening, we didn't speak, or the next day. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was charged heavy with resentment and certainty. He was convinced he'd done nothing wrong. I was slowly realizing I couldn't make him understand why he had. On the third day, Nicole called me again. She told me she could hear it in my voice that something in me had shifted. I broke down then, the dam finally giving way, and she listened without interrupting, without trying to fix it. When I finished, she said something that stuck with me. "Joyce, he doesn't just not respect you," she said quietly. "He assumes you'll stay anyway." That idea sank deep and didn't let go. Jacob assumed I'd swallow it, that I'd rationalize it, that I'd move on because that's what I'd always done. And for the first time, I didn't want to prove him right. Nicole said he needed to face consequences. Not a screaming match, not tears. Consequences that showed him his words weren't harmless, that his honesty wasn't noble. She said, half joking at first, that it would be interesting to hear him talk like that with Travis sitting right there. That Travis wouldn't laugh it off or call it harmless truth. She laughed when she said it, but something in her eyes told me she was serious. And something inside me, sharp and bitter and newly awake, latched onto the idea before I could stop it. By the end of the call, the hurt that had hollowed me out for days had been replaced by something colder. I wasn't thinking about fixing my marriage anymore. I wasn't even thinking about forgiveness. I was thinking about exposure. And once that thought took hold, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like balance. The idea should have terrified me. In hindsight, it should have sent me running in the opposite direction toward a lawyer, or at least a long, honest conversation about divorce. Instead, it settled into my mind with an unsettling sense of clarity, as if all the chaos of the last few days had finally organized itself around one sharp point. I told myself I wasn't being cruel. I told myself I was letting Jacob reveal who he really was out in the open, where he couldn't twist the story later and paint me as the hysterical wife. Nicole didn't push me into anything. That's important to say. The plan grew between us slowly in fragments, half jokes that hardened into intent. She said she wished Travis had been there the night Jacob said those things. I said it would have been different. She laughed and said, "Different is one word for it." We both knew exactly what she meant. I hated myself a little for how easily I slipped into the role I needed to play. That afternoon, I apologized to Jacob. I told him I'd overreacted, that I'd been sensitive because I was hungover and emotional. The words tasted bitter, but I forced them out anyway. I even cooked his favorite dinner, moving through the kitchen on autopilot, while he sat at the table smug and relieved. He didn't apologize back. He just smiled and told me he was glad I'd finally come to my senses. That should have stopped me. It should have been the moment I realized how far gone he was. Instead, it fueled me. When I suggested a double date with Nicole and Travis, his eyes lit up in a way that made my stomach twist. He agreed immediately, saying it would be fun, that we hadn't done that in a while. There was no hesitation, no awareness, just entitlement. The night before the date, I crossed the line that still makes my chest tighten when I think about it. I told Jacob that Nicole had confessed something to me. I said she'd had a crush on him for years, that she'd always wondered what might have happened if things were different. I even told him she wouldn't mind if he brought it up, that Travis didn't care because it was all harmless. He asked if Travis was really okay with it. For half a second, doubt flickered across his face. I lied without blinking. I told him Travis didn't mind at all. The pleasure on Jacob's face was immediate and unmistakable. He looked younger, somehow energized, like I'd just handed him proof of his own desirability. Watching that reaction, I felt my guilt soften into something closer to disgust. If this was all it took for him to consider betraying me openly, then the feelings he claimed were hypothetical had never been hypothetical at all. The restaurant Nicole chose was one of the nicest in the city. Low lighting, crisp white tablecloths, the kind of place where people spoke in measured tones and pretended not to listen to conversations around them. Nicole and I arrived together, both of us dressed carefully, deliberately. She squeezed my hand before Jacob and Travis arrived, her eyes searching mine one last time. "Are you sure?" she asked. I nodded. I wasn't sure of anything anymore except that I couldn't keep pretending. When Jacob walked in, his confidence bordered on arrogance. He greeted Nicole with a hug that lingered a beat too long. Travis watched without comment, his expression polite but reserved. I wondered fleetingly if he sensed something was off, if some part of him already knew where this was headed. Dinner started smoothly enough. Small talk, work complaints, travel plans, the kind of surface-level conversation that hid the tension curling beneath the table. We ordered wine. Glasses clinked. Laughter came easily to Jacob, too easily. After the second glass, I steered the conversation where I wanted it to go. I brought up the game from the other night, pretending it was a funny story, something harmless we'd laughed about. Nicole played her part perfectly, tilting her head, smiling, asking Jacob if he'd managed to come up with 5 names yet. He didn't hesitate this time. He said her name confidently, almost proudly, like he expected it to be welcomed. For a split second, the room froze. Nicole's smile faltered just enough to look shocked. I mirrored her reaction, widening my eyes, asking him what he meant. Travis's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Jacob kept talking. He said now that everything was out in the open. There was no point pretending there wasn't tension there. He said it like it was romantic, like he was confessing to something mutual and inevitable. When Travis told him to apologize and drop it, Jacob laughed. He said he wasn't going to apologize for telling the truth. He said feelings were feelings. He said now that we all knew there was nothing stopping him and Nicole from exploring it someday. I watched Travis's jaw tighten. I watched Nicole's hands curl into fists under the table. And in that moment, I realized something terrible. Jacob wasn't bluffing. He really believed this story he'd built for himself. He really thought he was untouchable. And there was no stopping what came next. The moment snapped like a wire pulled too tight. Travis stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp and ugly in the quiet restaurant. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He reached across the table and grabbed Jacob by the collar with one hand, yanking him forward so fast the glassware rattled. For a split second, everything felt unreal, like I was watching it through thick glass. Jacob barely had time to register what was happening before Travis drove his fist into his face. The impact was sickening, a dull, wet sound followed by a cry of shock, not just from Jacob but from the diners around us. Jacob collapsed back into his chair and then slid to the floor. Blood already spilling from his nose, splattering onto the pristine white tablecloth. Someone screamed. Someone else shouted for security. Nicole stood frozen beside me, her face drained of color, hands shaking. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might split my chest open. This wasn't how it was supposed to look. In my head it had been simpler, humiliating, yes, but contained. Not this, not blood. Travis didn't keep hitting him. That was the strange part. He stood over Jacob, breathing hard, his fists clenched, eyes burning with something dangerously close to restraint snapping. He told Jacob to stay down. His voice was low, controlled, far more frightening than yelling would have been. Security swarmed the table within seconds. People were ushered away. Phones were out. Whispers rippled through the room. Jacob tried to stand, slipping on the floor, cursing through the blood pouring down his face. Even then, even injured and humiliated, he tried to laugh it off, tried to taunt us, his words slurred and venomous. We were escorted out of the restaurant before the police could be called. The manager didn't want the publicity. I remember thinking how absurd that was, how violence could be swept aside for the sake of reputation. Outside, Jacob finally put it together. He looked at me, and Nicole really looked at us, and the realization hit him like a second blow. He called us cowards, said we'd set him up, said we'd planned the whole thing just to watch him get beaten. He wasn't wrong. Travis warned him to stop talking. He said one more word would put him in the hospital for days instead of hours. Jacob finally backed off, clutching his face, still seething with rage and disbelief. I didn't go home with him. I couldn't. Nicole and Travis dropped me off at a nearby hotel. In the car, we told Travis everything. How the plan started. How we'd lied. How we'd expected Jacob to embarrass himself, but not this. I braced myself for his anger, for disappointment, for judgment. Instead, he surprised me. He told us he was glad we hadn't told him beforehand. Said if he'd known, he might have walked away instead of reacting. He admitted he'd been working hard on his temper for years, that he hated how easily it still flared when someone disrespected Nicole like that. He said Jacob had been warned. He'd been given an out, and he'd chosen to push anyway. That night alone in the hotel room, my phone buzzed nonstop. Messages from Jacob, furious, accusing, self-pitying. He told me he'd gone to the ER alone, that his nose was broken, that I was disgusting for manipulating him, for getting him hurt over harmless honesty. He said what I did was psychotic, juvenile, unforgivable. He said he wanted a divorce. I stared at the screen for a long time. I felt a flicker of guilt imagining him alone in a hospital, terrified of blood, angry, and in pain. But beneath that guilt was something else, an unsettling calm. The marriage I'd been clinging to in my head was already gone. His words had killed it days ago. This had just made the corpse visible. I didn't respond. I slept instead, exhaustion finally dragging me under. In the morning, sobriety hit hard. With it came clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. What Nicole and I did wasn't brave. It wasn't mature. We'd orchestrated a situation knowing it could turn violent. We'd used Travis's protectiveness, his past struggles, as a tool for our own anger. The realization made my stomach twist. Jacob was wrong about almost everything, but he wasn't wrong about that. The internet would later call it what it was. Everyone sucked here. And as much as it hurt to admit it, I couldn't deny my part anymore. By the time 3 days had passed, the adrenaline was gone, replaced by a heavy, sobering sense of responsibility. The anger that had carried me through the restaurant, through the hotel room, through Jacob's furious messages, had thinned out into something quieter and far more uncomfortable. Guilt didn't erase what Jacob had said or done, but it sat beside those memories, now forcing me to look at the situation without the protection of rage. Nicole felt it too. We talked late into the night, picking apart everything we'd done, everything we'd justified in the heat of the moment. The more distance we had from that night, the more obvious it became how reckless our plan had been. We hadn't just exposed Jacob, we'd deliberately provoked someone else's trauma to do it. Travis's history with anger wasn't gossip or entertainment. It was something he'd been actively working to overcome, and we'd treated it like a convenient weapon. That realization hit harder than any insult Jacob had thrown at me. We agreed that an apology was necessary, not because Jacob deserved forgiveness for what he'd said, but because real harm had been done, and pretending otherwise would only make us the kind of people we never wanted to be. There was also the very real possibility of legal consequences. Jacob had been injured. Even if the restaurant wanted to keep things quiet, that didn't mean he couldn't decide later to press charges. Avoiding that didn't feel like the main reason to apologize, but it was impossible to ignore. So Nicole and I went back to the house. Jacob let us in without a word. He looked different, smaller somehow. His nose was still bandaged. His face bruised, his posture stiff with pain and resentment. Seeing the physical evidence of what had happened made my chest tighten. For a moment, the memory of him laughing on the couch weeks ago flickered through my mind, and I almost didn't recognize the man standing in front of me now. We packed my things in silence. Clothes, shoes, personal items that suddenly felt like artifacts from someone else's life. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place I'd overstayed. Right before we left, I stopped. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to speak. I told Jacob I was sorry for lying to him, for manipulating the situation, for letting things spiral into violence. I told him I never intended for him to be hurt, even if part of me had wanted him to finally feel the consequences of his words. I waited for some acknowledgement, some reflection, maybe even an apology in return. What I got instead was contempt. He told us to leave. He said our apologies were meaningless now that the damage was done. He said we should be grateful he hadn't pressed charges and implied that he was doing us a favor by even listening. Then he went further. He said both Nicole and I should feel lucky he'd ever shown interest in us at all because we were nothing compared to the women he'd been with before. He talked about giving us a chance, as if he were some prize we'd failed to appreciate. I was too stunned to interrupt, too stunned to even feel angry. When I tried to tell him we weren't asking for another chance, that this wasn't about getting him back, he slammed the door in our faces. Walking away from that house, something settled inside me with unexpected finality. The doubt I'd been carrying about whether I'd gone too far, whether I owed him more than an apology, evaporated. The man inside that house wasn't capable of self-awareness. He wasn't wounded into cruelty by the situation. He'd always been this way. I'd just finally seen it without the filter of love. Our conversation with Travis went very differently. We apologized sincerely for lying, for manipulating him, for putting him in a position that could have jeopardized everything he'd worked so hard for. He listened quietly, then surprised us again by saying we didn't owe him an apology at all. He admitted he hated that he'd reacted physically, but he didn't regret standing up for Nicole. He said Jacob had been warned. He'd been given an opportunity to stop. He chose not to. Even so, he accepted our apology. That mattered more than I expected. A few days later, I filed for divorce. Jacob was served the following day. His response was predictable. Angry texts, threats of regret, demands that I retrieve the rest of my belongings immediately or risk losing them. Nicole insisted I move in with her temporarily. She cleared out space, helped me pack what was left, never once making me feel like a burden. I don't know how I would have gotten through those first weeks without her. Jacob talked badly about me to our mutual friends, but it didn't land the way he thought it would. His version of events only highlighted his own behavior. People reached out to me quietly, offering support, telling me I was doing the right thing. I stopped defending myself. I didn't need to anymore. Looking back now, I can hold two truths at once. What Jacob said to me was cruel, demeaning, and unforgivable. What Nicole and I did in response was immature, reckless, and crossed a line. Accountability doesn't cancel pain, and pain doesn't excuse everything done in its name. Understanding that doesn't make the experience easier, but it makes it honest. The marriage is over. I'm grieving it in ways I didn't expect mourning, not just what I lost, but what I thought I had. But beneath the grief is something steadier than anger ever was. Clarity. Boundaries. The quiet knowledge that staying would have meant betraying myself far worse than leaving ever could. I don't know exactly what comes next. I just know I'll get there on my own terms.